nothing like losing your child. I couldn't bear watching him going through what he was going through, so I bought a bottle of vodka and some pills and I was going to kill him.
The Isle of Man finds itself in the midst of a moral dilemma, with residents set to be given the right to end their life when they want and avoid the indignity and suffering illness can bring. It's a decision that will not only affect the lives of the people on the island, but millions of others. Home to a little over 84,000 people, the Isle of Man is located in the middle of the Irish Sea, just 30 miles from the English coast. A crown dependency of the United Kingdom, politicians on the island have the power to make their own laws. And for the past 2 years, they've been debating whether to drastically change how they care for the most vulnerable, with assisted dying potentially being legalised for terminally ill residents with 12 months or less to live.
This will have health service implications, it will have moral and ethical implications, and it will be very, very testing and a very sensitive subject to deal with.
Often confused with euthanasia, where a medical professional administers the life-ending drugs, assisted dying requires the individual to be of sound mind and physically able to kill themselves. It's a right shared by millions of people in over half a dozen countries around the world, including the US, Canada, Belgium and the Netherlands, with bills now being raised in Scotland, England and Jersey. We went to the Isle of Man to speak to those fighting for the right to end their lives on their own terms, and those who fear its introduction could destroy the very fabric of society, and rather than help the most vulnerable, leave them at risk of abuse.
He was about 4-year-old on that one. His little face. I think he'd just been diagnosed there. It was just after his 50th birthday he was diagnosed. He died when he was 51. We came 23 years ago. We bought this building which needed renovating. My husband's always been in the building trade. He converted it into an 11-bedroom guest house, and we'd done that for 19 years, and it was great. I loved it, you know, especially when TT was on here on the island. I mean, it's a different island altogether when the TT's on. But in 2019, I had breast cancer, and we decided it was time to take time out and start and smell the roses before it was too late, you know. One of the things I did when I lived in Jesmond, I remortgaged my house and I bought 3 round the world tickets, and I took me and Janet and James backpacking for a year. They gave us a bottle of champagne on the plane because they thought it was a great story, a mother with her 2 kids remortgaging a house to take them travelling for a year. James was the kind of lad who would do anything for anybody. He got great pleasure out of helping people. He loved to sing, he loved to dance, and he had his voice recorded before he died. Sorry. Okay. He had one of the songs on it dedicated to me, and it was called "You Were Always on My Mind." Yeah. He had a little lump, the size of a pea, in his neck. He'd had one in his cheek a few years earlier, but it was just a cyst. He had a little scar. And he said, "Mum, I've got another one of these little lumps in my neck." Oh, I said, "James, go and get it seen to, son." Well, with me living on the island and him living on the borders of Scotland, I didn't see him for a while. So when I did see him, that little lump had gone to that size. The doctor made an appointment immediately at the hospital, and with next no time, he was told he had terminal cancer. They said if he'd gone when it was the size of a pea, there was a chance they could have cured him, but he'd left it too late, and the cancer had gone right through him. He died a horrific death. Horrific. Hence why I'm really, really hoping that this assisted dying goes through so no other mother has to watch their child going through what me and Janet watched with James.
A number of people on the Isle of Man are fighting to change the law after having watched their loved ones suffer until the very end, long after a cruel illness had taken over.
That's Billy and this is Gift. And he was called Gift because I said nobody'd let me have another dog while I had Ella. My daughter-in-law took this one when he was ill and he was really fed up, and then he managed to do that smile. And that summed him up because it was hard work getting outside. She wanted the lighting for Ella because Ella doesn't show up in here.
I first came to the Isle of Man in 1988, so I've been here quite a long time. I used to take in young girls who were pregnant and had been thrown out of home. We ran the guest house for 5 years, and then I've had various jobs within Manx National Heritage. And one year I went to work at Duke Marketing, and Simon was my manager. That's how I met him. We were together altogether 17 years. He was quite quiet, very patient and kind. This was his dog, and he adored her. He had 2 children of his own, which he thought the world of, and 2 grandchildren, which we used to have every weekend. And he took on a second job when my daughter was going to uni so that she wouldn't have to pay to go through uni, wouldn't have to have a job and could concentrate on her studies, which to me was phenomenal because it wasn't even his daughter, you know. But that's the sort of person he was, very caring. He came home one day after walking Ella and said he'd fallen over in the field and that it wasn't the first time, and he'd put it down to the long grass, but he thought it was odd that he'd fallen over for no apparent reason. And then a few days later he fell over at work, and that was a completely flat floor. His walking kept deteriorating. We struggled to get him in for tests. In the end we borrowed my friend's mother's Zimmer, that's how bad he was, and I took him to A&E in that. And I went in and I said, you don't send him home until you know what this is. So he went away for the tests and we waited another week. And then the neurologist sat us down and he said, it was motor neurone disease and it was the most aggressive form you can get. And when Simon asked how long, he said, a maximum of 2 years. Simon actually only had 11 months from that diagnosis. He was paralysed within 2.
When the bill was raised in 2022, a public consultation was set up to give residents an opportunity to share their feelings on assisted dying. Over 3,000 people responded, with the population split down the middle.
I've had cancer and still going through treatment. And if I was to get really bad, yeah, I can't see the problem.
I think it's great that we're actually a little bit ahead of some people. I think a lot of people are really anxious about it.
I think it's very good that it's being talked about. People are able to give serious thought to what obviously is always going to be a difficult and for anyone involved an extremely personal question.
I'm in favour of it as long as it's properly controlled and everything. It has to be done properly, definitely. I think there's a lot of people who do get some terrible illnesses and they don't want to carry on, do they? And that should be their choice.
But with so much on the line, the bill has come up against strong opposition from local politicians and residents on the island, as well as a large number of doctors who argue it will endanger the lives of those they have sworn an oath to care for.
Mr. Speaker, this bill changes the social contract. It changes in such a way that the state, in which we have come to absolutely believe is there to support you as appropriate throughout your life, now also, it seems, is about to determine and wishes to play a role in ending your life.
Last year, 74% of members of the Isle of Man Medical Society rejected the bill, with over a third threatening to leave the island if it were brought in.
I found I got on really well with the elderly when I was a junior doctor. Of all the patient groups that I looked after, they were the people that I naturally gravitated to and talked to. Geriatrics is a speciality of all parts of the body, so you're dealing with the whole system and the person in front of you. You still have the need to apply an awful lot of nuance and balancing up multiple issues carrying on, so how the person feels, what the family issues are, what the home situation is. So it's the whole psychosocial assessment that goes on. My challenge is, having looked in depth at what assisted dying does in the jurisdictions it comes into, one person's choice can negatively impact on somebody else. I'm very much a logical thinker, so I've tried to work through the logic of what it means and what the implications are and what the outcomes might be and who's going to be harmed more or less by it. And in terms of logic, it feels to me that you can't come up with an answer that works for assisted dying. Does my gut instinct tell me the same thing? Absolutely. It makes me feel slightly queasy when I think about it.
The bill has also been opposed by some religious leaders, concerned by what it says about the direction society is heading in.
There was a Victorian preacher called Charles Spurgeon who said that the preacher should have the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. I think a good minister has to be caring, has to listen, has to be able to understand and communicate the Bible in ways that are relevant to people. I think if we have the assisted dying law come into place on the Isle of Man, it will have a number of different implications. I think it's going to bring a lot of pressure onto a number of vulnerable people. Seeing a parent in pain and saying, "Mum, wouldn't you be better off just taking the pills and slipping away?" could just as easily be, "Mum, I'm not sure I can cope with this." This will change the way people feel about being a burden and needing to do the right thing to take the tablets and to end their lives.
Choice can be subjective and you can change your mind, and choice can be coerced. You get offered a choice, then that becomes a suggestion, why don't you? And suddenly you feel like you've got an obligation to take that up. My other big issue is that the way the law is set up, you have to decide that somebody is mentally competent to make that decision. And having been working for the last 18 years as a consultant, assessing people's capacity to make choices, it's incredibly difficult and nuanced. And when you're talking about death, being 100% is never possible.
There seem to be a lot of concerns from many members of the medical profession. In principle, I'm not really in favour. It looks a bit rushed and not completely thought through.
In certain cases, I agree with it. It's got to be people who haven't got long to go and they don't want to be here anyway because they're suffering.
If you've ever watched anybody die, family members with cancer or whatever, and you're just waiting for the disease to kill them, it's pathetic. If there's no quality of life left, there's no point in being here.
There have to be a lot of safeguards. I know that there are quite a few other jurisdictions where it has come in, and I think it's pretty necessary to learn what have been the good points and maybe the negative points. So if it does happen here, all of those are taken on board.
This bill is clearly condemned by most professionals. It lacks due diligence. It risks severely shortening the lives of many vulnerable people. It turns on its head the dictum, first of all, do no harm, offering killing in place of caring. It is unfunded, but it is requiring inordinate amounts of expensive MHK and government officer time, and despite all this, is being allowed to progress by MHK.
I'm the third member of the House of Keys who's tried to bring in an assisted dying bill. We've been discussing it in our Parliament for over 20 years. Now, I've come into Parliament with a GP and a doctor's background, but I'm still a practicing GP. So I can understand how medicine has changed over the years, how now listening to the patient's voice and trying to work with a patient for the best care for them is so important. Assisted dying allows a dying person the support and choice to have control over their own death if they decide their suffering is unbearable. It involves a defined system where terminally ill, mentally competent adults can be prescribed life-ending drugs to administer themselves after meeting strict legal safeguards. Within our legislation at the moment, there are lots of references to coercion. But what we do have within the legislation is that people would sit down and go through what they want and why they want it with two independent doctors. And if there are any concerns about their depression or their mental capacity, they can then be double-checked by a psychiatrist as well. So people would be seen without their relatives being there, without friends being there. They'd be interviewed one-on-one to try to get to the grips of why they would want an assisted death, and to be absolutely certain that they weren't being either pressurised into it or weren't doing it for other reasons, whether that be lack of knowledge, lack of education, or lack of knowledge of the alternative options that are available in terms of palliative care.
Your psychological and psychiatric state that can make you feel bad about yourself. And the first few months after a terminal diagnosis, depression rates go through the roof. And then after a year, they got back to normal again. So you've got this bit in the middle where your mind is certainly geared towards not being there at all. So there's lots of reasons why I don't think you can ever fully safeguard any law of this nature anywhere.
The people on the Isle of Man are very forward thinking, and they will have this signed up so there's no loopholes. Believe you me, I have every faith in them. So if people would stop living on what if and let's get it done, it would be better for everybody.
I don't think it's human nature for everybody, but the question is, do we want to change the law to enable a few people who might want to die to have that choice? Or do we want to protect people who might end up dying not through their choice?
One day he asked me to leave the room when two of his favourite nurses from hospice were here. They eventually came out to me and they said that Simon had said he wanted to make it to the TT, and after that he wanted his food stopping so that he'd starve to death. I know the coercion thing has come into this a lot. I think the reason that Simon told the nurses that he wanted his food stopping was because he thought if he told me, I would say no. That would have been my instant thing, with no time to think about it, as I did in the kitchen with the nurses. It's automatic to say no. Now, I'm not saying everybody else is going to be like that. There are some bad people about, but I find it highly unlikely. Now, I can't say what will happen. I can't. I can only talk on my personal experience, and my personal experience is nobody should suffer what Simon did, and I'm fighting for this so that people have that choice.
Sue and Millie are not alone in their campaign to see residents given the option of ending their lives when the time comes. They and others feel strongly that while hospice and palliative care brings comfort to many, there are still those who are forced to spend their final days in unbearable and needless pain and suffering. Some want the bill to go even further and allow people suffering intolerably from an incurable condition to also be given access to assisted dying.
Our MHKs have had some really long and interesting discussions about all such issues. We think it will apply probably to fewer than 10 people a year on the Isle of Man, so it doesn't really affect the whole of the community. It is just precisely those people who are suffering.
I was born and raised on the Isle of Man. It's beautiful, it's quiet, it's peaceful, low crime rate. Just everything about the Isle of Man really is lovely. I've been a humanist for many, many years, and humanists believe in the science, reason and logic, but also a basic part of humanism is human kindness and compassion. And I think if you have kindness and compassion, then you must support assisted dying. I've never been one to keep quiet, and if I feel strongly about something, then I will try and campaign to achieve what I want to achieve. Also, as a humanist funeral celebrant, I sometimes meet families for whom the best of palliative care, and we have an excellent palliative care system over here. We've got a wonderful hospice with great personnel, and they do a great job, but there are always the odd family for whom the best of that care does not work. Plus, I'm getting older myself, and I want that to be available for me should I need it. So there's a certain amount of self-interest as well.
I'm desperate to get it through in case this cancer returns. Honestly, hand on heart, I am. You know, I don't want to die like James died. Like lots of my friends have died, like lots of my family died. My mother had it, my aunt had it, and they all died awful deaths, painful deaths.
If I get something like this and this bill doesn't go through, I'm going to kill myself immediately while I've still got, because you don't know when you're not going to be able to.
For me, it's the obvious thing, and I think it's a really kind, humane thing to offer to people who are suffering intolerably, people say, how can you measure intolerably? You ask the person. And if they say it's intolerable, it's intolerable.
Who's to say it should stop here or here or here? In the Netherlands, started off tight, and now we had in May a 28-year-old called Zaraya Terbik who went through euthanasia for depression. And you can see the same again and again and again, that it expands.
Some of these illnesses where they say they're in pain all the time, my personal opinion is they too should be given the choice. But I would not bring it for mental health.
We can perhaps all think of all the situations where, if you've known somebody, or perhaps a relative, perhaps a father, and actually they may well have taken that choice if it was available to them. But actually, well, what else might you have missed out on if they had been able to take that choice? So that's why it's not just enough to look at the law. We absolutely have to think about how this will work in practice.
Many people are worried about what they see as a slippery slope, that when you provide access to assisted dying, it will encompass more and more people. On the Isle of Man, we've got a very limited bill that's just looking at terminal illness. And it's taken 20 years to even get to this stage. So I think the idea that once you get legislation in, it automatically will expand is incorrect. And the practices of other, particularly European countries, where that has been expanded to people with mental health problems, even children, or people with non-terminal conditions that may cause unbearable suffering.
There is no politician that will last forever, and no law that is unchangeable. And certainly from the other countries that have brought in law like this, it becomes more and more permissive and more encompassing as the years go by. If the reason for choosing to end your life by a doctor is because of pain and suffering, why is my pain and suffering any less valid than yours? Why do I then need a terminal diagnosis? Well, I'm in pain, this is intolerable, I want to have it too. Why do I have to have a physical condition? I've got a mental health disorder, that's causing intolerable suffering, I want it as well. And whenever these decisions are challenged, it seems to be, yes, of course, you're right, you should have it too, so we will let you have it as well. So it does become a slippery slope with more and more people being pulled into a process that was never intended for them from the first place, but it inevitably happens over time.
70 miles away in Lancaster, in England, one man has already been given the green light to have an assisted death in Switzerland. Alex Pandolfo was diagnosed with Alzheimer's in 2015 after noticing some concerning changes to his mental state, struggling at work and becoming confused at home. And while those who oppose assisted dying argue it's another form of suicide, one that could see people choose to opt out of life in their darkest moments, he says it's the reason he's still here today, almost a decade on from his diagnosis.
This is where the festival was a festival. You know, I was shocked when I went to one and it finished at 11 o'clock, because it was like, if it was a 3-day festival, it went on for 3 days. And I think it was either this one this year or the year before that Leonard Cohen was on. I remember Leonard Cohen being on at like 2 o'clock in the morning. I've never been worried about death. Once I got the diagnosis of Alzheimer's in 2015, I couldn't carry on working, because even now I still struggle with spelling and putting that. If that's Alzheimer's or if that's something else, I don't know. I'm being perfectly honest at this stage. I know I couldn't continue with what I was doing, and I decided to just continue campaigning for the right to die in the UK and internationally. So I'd run an education consultancy at the time, and I found time was vanishing. You know, I'd be sat down at the table and it'd be morning, and then I don't know, some radio program might come on, a television might come on, and I'm thinking, where's that day gone? I was having little mishaps in the kitchen, or not eating, you know, things like that. So I went to see the doctor, and he referred me to the memory clinic, and he said, you've got Alzheimer's. And he said to me, you don't seem particularly concerned about this. So I said, well, there's not much point in being concerned about it. It won't go away. I said, it's something that I suspected, and I know exactly what course of action I will be taking. So he said, well, what do you mean by that? So I said, well, I'm a long-term supporter of assisted dying. And I said, I'm not going to go home straight away and do it. I said, but certainly over the next couple of weeks, I'll be filling an application form in for an assisted death at Life Circle in Switzerland. And then he jumped from that and said, I am also diagnosing you as clinically depressed. So he's obviously seen me as suicidal, yeah, which is, anything that I'd said up to now would not suggest to anybody, I wouldn't have thought that that was a suicidal statement to make. Applying for assisted death in Switzerland, it's not as easy as people think, which is a good thing. First thing, you've got to be a member of one of the centres that provide an assisted death. In terms of the application, my personal process was I wrote to Life Circle and said that I'd been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. But then you have to, I couldn't work it out at first. I thought, will you do a biography? But when I started writing it, I realised why you had to write that type of thing. What you got writing down is probably one of the most counterintuitive things to a human person, is you're writing why you want to die. No one can coerce you into writing that and going through that and experiencing that. Really, really painful. It's the most difficult thing I've ever had to write. And then because I was diagnosed with a condition that raises questions about capacity, I had to go for a psych assessment, and that was just for my application. And once that had gone through, I got the green light. Which was a great relief to me, because I'd already planned my suicide in case I didn't get it, because I was aware of what, and I'm using this word deliberately, could come, not what would come, but I had an idea of what could come, and what could come. There was no way I was going to live, or try to live through that type of thing. So that green light negated the need to do that. It saved my life. That was 10 years ago. I've had a brilliant 10 years. I don't have to worry about what's going to happen. If I start to deteriorate soon, I've got my insurance policy.
I have the privilege, as a number of people do, of course, but of walking alongside people who are suicidal, and I've spent a number of hours with people looking to persuade them that their lives are worth continuing to live, that their lives are valuable. And it seems strange to me that here on the island we have a suicide prevention strategy, and then we're bringing in legislation for assisted suicide. I did have one conversation last year with someone who was suicidal, had attempted suicide, and I was talking to this person, and they said to me, I wish this law was in place, because I would just go for it. Now, as it happens, they wouldn't have qualified for the law as it's currently being introduced, but that's not the point. It just changes an outlook, and it normalises suicide, and I think that's something that is just really dangerous and concerning.
Many honourable members will be aware of my long-standing commitment to the Salvation Army, a Christian church and international charitable organisation. It assists thousands of vulnerable people every day. Our mission statement says that we will meet human needs without discrimination, and our services are offered freely to all, regardless of gender, race or sexual orientation. As a freely committed member to the Salvation Army, I obviously fully subscribe to and entirely support its doctrines and philosophy. I would therefore oppose the introduction of any legalisation in support of assisted dying, assisted suicide or euthanasia in the Isle of Man.
In the countries where this has been done, you see a lot of vulnerable people that get brought into assisted dying, people with depression that are allowed to end their life when they could have been treated, people not offered appropriate palliative care that think there's no other way of doing it. So I don't take the premise that we can go down the route of saying that people should, and doctors can do a really good job of explaining it all and it'll all make it fine. I don't think you can ever safeguard people from this law. That's my problem. This law demands that health professionals go down a route and a rabbit hole that we've never done before, which is actively seeking to end life.
You know, the people who are against assisted dying, I've often said this to one or two people when I've had the conversation with them. Have you ever sat and watched your child or somebody you love very much dying in horrific pain? Well, no, not really. I said, then you haven't got a clue what you're talking about. I said, you have not got a clue. We would talk about everything, James and I. We were really, really close. He says, because he had dogs, he says, when the dogs are poorly to the point where, you know, there's going to be no hope for them, he says, you're going to have them put to sleep. Why? He says, I still can't understand why people have got to wait till the end if there's something can be done for them, you know. So we had a long discussion about it. If assisted dying had been in, I know James would have opted for it. I know this is not a very nice thing to say, but when you're desperate, I couldn't bear watching him going through he was going through, so I bought a bottle of vodka and some pills and I was going to kill him. Anyway, the day I was going to do it, and I went with the bottle of vodka and the pills, Janet says, Mum, you can't even swallow anymore. Oh, no, God, I've left it too late. I hadn't said anything to them. I hadn't told them. I told Janet afterwards, after he died, I told Janet what I was going to do. I thought, well, I'd brought him into the world. Sure, it was my right to take him out, not to stand by and watch him suffer the way he was suffering. It was horrible. Nobody should have to suffer like that. Nobody. It's nothing like losing your child. Yeah, I know he was 51. But he was still my baby. Do you understand? He was my baby. And it just didn't seem fair. Why?
He was in an awful lot of pain. When he'd gone into hospice to have the breathing tested, he came out with a thumbprint of a pink mark. It was nothing, but this thing spread. The last 2 weeks, but specifically the last week, were pure hell. Eventually, it was the pain from that, but it was just destroying him. All he was saying most of the time was, can you please make it stop? I can't stand it. And I asked the nurse why they couldn't make this thing better. Why was it just getting worse and worse and worse? And she said, remember when some of his teeth went missing and we said he'd swallowed them? That's because his gums were decomposing. And so the teeth just fall out. And that's what's happening to his backside. It's just literally decomposing while he's still alive. And I'm talking about the whole of it, you know, just rotting away under him. And they couldn't stop the pain, and they couldn't let him go. And they should have been able to let him go. And eventually, I physically and mentally collapsed. And at that point, the nurses came in, and one of the hospice nurses got permission to give him a slight, I don't know if it was more morphine or a stronger drug, I don't know what it was. But bless, after he'd had it, for nearly an hour, he was pain-free. And he said, oh, this is great. If they keep giving me this, I might even be able to go and watch the racing. And then he went into the coma, and they took him into hospice and he died the following morning. He should have had that the week before, whatever it was. I don't care what it was. It made him pain-free for a short time, and then he went to sleep. This could have all have been done really quickly, and he wouldn't have had to suffer like he did. And quite frankly, I can't understand anybody who's against it, because if you've seen what I'd seen, there's no way you'd let anybody go like that.
Some people in this chamber have said that this is a seismic change in the way government and the state has a relationship with the people, in that it's taking somebody's life. I disagree. I think this is very much about dealing with somebody who's terminally ill, facing death and shortening that death and giving them the power and ability to have control over that and choice. I think there's a lot of fear and anxiety about change and about doing this. But the reality is I have fear and anxiety about the situation at the moment where there are people there who are suffering in silence with terminal illness and not able to have an open and frank conversation with their family, friends or doctors about what they really want for their last days or weeks or months of life.
The people who are going to be accessing assisted dying are dying. They're going to be dying. They have a terminal diagnosis. What we are doing is bringing that death forward by maybe a few days, maybe a few weeks, possibly even a few months, but that's all we're doing. They're going to die.
The command, do not kill, is there for a very good reason. We should be focusing our resources, our efforts into helping people to be able to live their lives well, to continue to press into dealing with pain in all of its forms, and to helping people to live a good life. If we rub out that line in the sands that says human life is to be valued and is not to be taken through an intervention, then we start to devalue life. There's a huge question over whether that's the sort of society we want to become.
If you have one place where we become known as the death island, I mean, geriatricians, general practitioners, palliative care doctors, oncology, we're all the specialities that are exposed to this the most. And most of the time, we're the people that dislike the concept of this law more than everybody else. So you've got one island which encourages it and facilitates it, but how do you recruit people to come when they may have to participate in it? I don't know what the future holds exactly, but it's a real worry that recruitment and retention will be made even more challenging by this law.
It's about individual suffering. It's about individual pain. It's about the quality of life that is acceptable to that individual. Everybody has the right to say no. Everybody has the right to say, yes, I support it. Everybody has the right to say, I really don't know and I wouldn't like to vote on it. So everybody's got a say in it and an opinion, and it's valuable. If you don't agree with it for yourself, don't do it, but don't deny me my choice.
Whether they agree with it or whether they don't agree with it, at least people are talking now. And I think people will eventually see that it's not this big, terrible thing. It's just giving them choice to how they want to end their lives.
I don't think anybody should be made to suffer. You're saying no, you sit there decomposing in agony, you just sit there and suck it up because I'm not going to allow you to have this bill. And it makes me angry.